You can have the most brilliant plot and world for your novel, but if readers don't care about your characters, they're going to put your book down. I'm Sarah Hoffman, founder of Inimitable Books, and today we're talking about proven techniques that make characters feel real, compelling, and worth rooting for. What I see in a lot of manuscripts are characters who exist to serve the plot instead of driving it. They are perfectly nice people who do perfectly reasonable things. There are some who do less nice things than others, and I will be discussing villains at longer length in the next video. But there's nothing that makes readers particularly invested in whether these bland characters succeed or fail. In the opposite direction, characters who are so quirky and unique they don't feel like real people are also a turnoff. They will have lists of random traits and hobbies, but no core that holds it together in a cohesive manner. The characters that readers care about aren't perfect, and they shouldn't be. They're not just collections of interesting details or a perfect person. They're people who feel real and whose struggles matter because we see ourselves in them. Now, before I dive in further, let's clarify something important. This video is about character development, which includes internal conflict. And internal conflict are the struggles that happen inside your character's head and heart. External conflict, which is the plot and the events and obstacles of the outside world, antagonists, and other challenges you place in front of your character. But external conflict only matters if we care about the character. Internal conflict is what makes readers emotionally invested. It's the gap between who your character is and who they need to become. It's their fears, flaws, contradictions, and all the messy human stuff beneath the surface. It's what makes them more than just words on a page or a flat two-dimensional stand-in for a reader. So when I talk about character development, building that rich internal life makes readers care about your plot. Every compelling character has a want and a need, and usually those two things are not the same and are actually in conflict. The want is the conscious thought of what your character thinks will make them happy or solve their problems. It drives their actions because they are aware of it as a goal. They need to eventually learn that what they need is growth or fulfillment. In The Giver by Lois Lowry, which is one of my favorite books, and I'll be talking more about it in a later video of this playlist about dystopian fiction, the main character Jonas wants to be accepted in his community rather than isolated, which is a requirement of his vocation as the receiver of memory. What he actually needs, even though he doesn't realize it at the start of the book, is an education on what his world has lost in its pursuit of creating a utopia, and also discovering he's actually living in a dystopian world. And when he starts realizing that what he wants was misguided, that creates tension within him because that desire to fit into a world isn't good if the world he wants to fit into is actually harmful. And what he wanted is more comfortable than his changing circumstances. The tension between want and need creates internal conflict that we just talked about. And the struggle within your character makes them feel three-dimensional. All this contributes to the character arc, the journey that your character goes through as they pursue what they want and discover what they need. Remember, your character is going to spend a lot of time, if not the majority of the first half of their book, maybe even the first 3/4 of your book, pursuing what they want. They're going to make choices based on getting what they think they need, but it is not what they actually need. Along the way, the external conflicts, like I mentioned earlier, being plot obstacles or antagonists, are going to force your main character to confront situations that reveal what they actually need. And by the climax, they need to choose between continuing pursuing what they want or getting what they actually need. For a satisfying character arc, they need to ultimately choose what they need, even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. There are character arcs that have a character remain the same, and if you are intentionally writing that, you need to commit to that. But most stories that we talk about as examples that we love here on this channel and in general in society are stories that follow the hero's journey, which is something I talk about in our video on this channel about outlining. So I will leave that linked in a card. But when I talk about character arc, the assumption is that your character will be ending the book differently than how they started it. That journey and struggle to change is why readers care. You need to give your character a flaw that is directly connected to both their internal struggle and the external plot. A flaw that has no impact on either or just one of these aspects isn't interesting enough to drive the story. Let's switch genres to romance. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, both aspects of the title apply to both Darcy and Elizabeth. Darcy's pride is very obvious, as is his prejudice against lower classes, because back then it was not ideal to marry down. However, if you were in a lower class, it was absolutely ideal to marry up. His pride and prejudice against marrying someone of a lower rank creates problems for Elizabeth and his family, even if he is well-meaning when he meddles in his best friend's relationship with Elizabeth's older sister. Her pride and prejudice creates problems in her relationship with Darcy that potentially could have been resolved faster had she not had the same character flaws as her love interest. It's a case of two similar repelling each other, which is the opposite of opposites attract. Now, I'm not saying that this book commits the sin that many other romances sometimes do, of having a simple communication that could have been fixed with a single conversation and the whole plot unravels if your characters were their age and were mature enough to have that heart-to-heart. Like I mentioned before, living at the time this book was written, and it was written as a contemporary book, Regency England was built on the necessity of marrying between classes and also looking down and shaming it when it happened, depending on where you were in the power imbalance. And those classes factors, which arguably still exist today all over the world, is not going to be solved by a single heart-to-heart between Darcy and Elizabeth, although they certainly argue about it. But you can see how these character traits on both Elizabeth and Darcy's ends, especially because they take them to the extreme, which makes them flaws, propels the plot. The best character flaw will serve multiple purposes. It will make a character feel human. It will create obstacles that complicate the external plot and also give the character room to grow internally. But you also need to make sure the flaw feels organic to the character and is not just a convenience for your plot. It needs to stem from your character's backstory, their worldview, and or their fear. If your character's flaw is that they never ask for help because they believe doing so is a weakness, you should absolutely have it make sense. Most people aspire for self-reliance in Western cultures, but the absolute avoidance of needing to depend on anyone else is normally a trauma response because someone has been let down, perhaps even betrayed. And in a situation like that, your character is going to be wrestling with the pride that they want of accomplishing something themselves, fear of vulnerability, and mistrust of others, perhaps even mistrust of themselves because they weren't able to recognize that someone was going to hurt them and prevent it from happening. They take on too much for themselves. They miss opportunities where collaboration would lead to better outcomes, and it probably means that they isolate themselves. All of this creates conflict, is an easy way to raise the stakes, and gives you plot complications that feel earned because they come from who your character is inside. The flaw should always actively make their journey more difficult. By the end of the story, your character should either have overcome this flaw, learned to manage it, or face serious consequences for not addressing it. Characters become likable when readers can see both vulnerability and strength in them. And if you can do it at the same time, that's even better. Vulnerability without strength can make a character seem weak or pathetic. But strength without vulnerability makes them seem invincible, inhuman, maybe arrogant, and a lot of other negative connotations. And if this is your main character, you want to make sure that your readers, even if they don't like them, still root for them. If you have your character be kind instead of being hurtful to others despite being hurt themselves, that shows moral integrity and that allows readers to care more. For example, in the original 1994 Lion King, the subsequent Broadway show that opened in 1997, and the completely unnecessary CGI remake, we have scenes of Simba being vulnerable as an adult because he is forced to reckon with his past and whether or not he's going to return to Pride Rock. In the movie, he talks to his father in the clouds in a super majestic scene where we hear James Earl Jones's voice, and he expresses the pain and anger at being left without a guide. In the musical, that scene is expanded into a beautifully choreographed and poignant lyrically poignant song called, I actually have a quote from the song tattooed on my arm, which is incidentally a quote from a song in Les Miserables, which is a different musical. But before I get too sidetracked about that, let's return to the actual example. Simba's vulnerability in this scene doesn't make him weak. It makes him three-dimensional without the CGI, and it makes his choice to return to reclaim his rightful place as king an act of bravery, because in doing so, he is confronting the traumatic past he's run from and tried to forget. If you show what scares your character and then show them facing those fears and pursuing their goals anyway, in spite of having to confront things that they would rather ignore, that vulnerability will create you need to show what scares your character and then force them to face it. That vulnerability will create internal conflict for them, and their struggle with doubt, fear, and insecurity shows their struggle then creates an opportunity to show their strength when they push through. In scenes where your character is being strong, making brave decisions, standing up for themselves or loved ones, taking actions against external obstacles, you need to include a moment that shows what it costs them. If your character can easily make brave overtures without any thought or concern about what it could cost them if they are wrong or make a mistake, it's going to get boring quickly. But if you let your readers see them struggle before they push through it, it's going to have a much stronger impact. Someone who's been a coward for a lot of the story suddenly becoming brave is huge. And it hits different than a lot of the original myths of King Arthur, where he was impenetrable and perfect. The reason so many people like the show Merlin is it showed this mythical and powerful wizard making mistakes. And it showed that Arthur was not a perfect king from the get-go. He had to learn to be a good leader. That journey allows viewers to invest in those characters. The most powerful character moments aren't actually the ones where they are purely strong or even when they're purely vulnerable. It's when they're able to bring those together and keep going. It feels real because that's how real courage works. Readers care about characters who make active choices, especially difficult ones. Even if they make the wrong choice, the fact they're actively trying to solve their problems makes them more engaging than a character who only reacts to what happens to them. And I say only because a character who is only acting to engage the plot and never reacting to things is also tiring. Sometimes things happen outside of our control. If your story shows a character who always has control, at the very least in setting things in motion, even if things go wrong, but they never react and just charge into their next plan, that's unrealistic and readers aren't going to be able to empathize with that character. An example that shows both is an Inimitable Books title. A Diamond Bright and Broken by Holly Davis shows our main character, Cadence, who must regularly cry diamond tears to support her sister's medical treatments, which she wants to do out of love. She is also forced by her parents to fund their increasingly expensive lifestyle as they climb the social ladder. At the start of the book, we get a flashback of emotional abuse and manipulation and a hint of even physical abuse that she has undergone at the hands of her parents that has led to her doing what they say for many years. From the outside, it seems like she's choosing to capitulate, that she's being weak, that she's only reacting to her circumstances. But it is more complicated than that. If you know anything about psychology or have been to therapy, you might have heard of something called fawning. It's the often ignored third option in the fight or flight discussion. Fawning is when someone gives in to an oppressor to survive. In A Diamond Bright and Broken, Cadence has had to do that for many years. But once the story's events get started, Cadence is making her own decisions. She actively decides that she's going to leave home once she hears that her gift might be a curse and wants to search for a cure for herself so that her parents will stop abusing her. She chooses to be kind to people who are initially cruel at first because they themselves have been hardened by misfortune. And Cadence chooses to hear out a character who is dishonest with her. She could have made the opposite choice in all of these most cases. Even though she is unhappy at home, she could have chosen to stay where she is essentially in a gilded cage, but at least it is familiar. She could have chosen to snap back at the people who were cruel to her and met fire with fire. And she could have chosen to ice out the person who was dishonest with her, but instead chose to hear them out. I can't talk much more without seeing the book, but while Cadence starts the story passive because she had to be, she doesn't take things lying down for most of the story, and that's what makes it interesting. In your own stories, every major scene needs to have your character making some kind of decision. And if that decision is to fawn, in a story, you need to show why. In real life, sometimes it's automatic. Is your character going to tell a truth or a lie in an instance where either one has dire consequences? Is your character going to help someone or walk away? What does each choice cost them? And is your character going to take a risk that could play off very well for them, or stay in the safety that they know, even if it means that they are giving up a lot of potential? Your character's choices is going to reveal who they are even more to your readers. It's going to show them the internal values and priorities driving your character. And it gives readers a sense of agency through your protagonist as they navigate the external plot. Because if your character is a passenger in their life, your reader is automatically even more passive because they are not able to influence your character's choices. And I kept saying in the examples that the choices need to have costs. They need to be genuinely difficult. If the right choice is obvious and there's no tension in watching your character make it, that's not interesting. The best choices are when both options have real costs and real benefits. If your character values both loyalty and honesty, but there is a situation where they can't have both, they're going to have to choose one over the other. And in doing so, they might experience guilt later, which could then make them choose something different in the future. Or maybe they have to choose between two people they care about, and it could be a life or death situation where by saving one, you are sacrificing the other. I think it needs to be said that your character can and should make the wrong choice at times. Characters who are always making the right choice feel unrealistic and boring. Characters who act impulsively and choose badly under pressure feel more human than those who are never flustered by anything. A reader will forgive a character for making a mistake as long as the mistake is true to who the character is at that point in time. Real people are contradictory. Maybe they're brave in some situations, but cowardly in others. Everyone is going to have blind spots and inconsistencies, and that's normal for people, so it should be built into your characters. Until the Last Page by Chantal Godoy, which is another Inimitable Books title, shows Josephine unlucky in love, but simultaneously better at recognizing it than the Frog Prince Aneurin, who needs true love's kiss to break his spell. From the start of their unlikely alliance, Jo is able to call out his misguided assumptions about relationships. She has never truly experienced those good things herself. And while some might call that hypocritical, it also makes sense because someone who comes from a broken relationship would be able to recognize unhealthy aspects that someone who has never been disillusioned wouldn't notice. But she also has a blind spot for the love she used to believe in from fairy tales because she has walled herself off from the possibility that true love exists at all. A character who's confident in a professional setting but insecure in personal relationships can absolutely feel real if it's handled well. A character who's perfectly consistent in all situations, like I mentioned before, feels flat and uninteresting. The key is to make sure the contradictions stem from the character's internal psychology and not from external demands of the plot or from careless writing. If your character is confident at work but insecure in personal relationships, has no reason to have such a difference in how they interact with other people, that's not going to land well. But if your character has built their identity around professional achievement because that feels controllable while personal relationships are full of unpredictable factors and feels incredibly risky to them, that would justify why they are confident in one scenario and not the other. And it allows you to explore their fear of vulnerability. You also need to think that, like many people in the world, some characters might not be aware of their contradictions and hypocrisy. They think themselves one thing, and yet their actions say that they are actually another. Going back to Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth doesn't believe that she is prejudiced. She can admit that she has pride and doesn't like being insulted by Darcy, even though he doesn't know she was listening. But her not recognizing she has the same flaws as her love interest creates conflict. Being able to empathize with your characters and readers' ability to empathize with your characters, even if they don't like said character, is super important. And you can do that by making sure the emotions your character feel and experience are ones that your readers recognize. In The Storm Gathers by Malin Holiday, we have a fantasy world where magic is real, dragons exist, as do gods and goddesses. All three of her main characters are forced to decide if they can trust strangers or past enemies. While you may never have had an enemy in real life, I think we can all empathize, or at least sympathize, with what it feels like to internally war with your gut instinct when a logical choice is risky. You worry you're making the wrong decision, which in fiction makes for a more exciting plot, but in real life can be a bummer if not traumatic. Universal emotions with potentially less dire outcomes include fear of failure, desire for acceptance, and ambition. When your character feels emotions like those, even in extraordinary circumstances, readers can still connect with them. The external situation, the plot, the obstacles, the antagonists can be as unique as you want, but the internal emotional core should be something readers have felt or witnessed. A reader hopefully hasn't seen a loved one murdered like Spider-Man did with Uncle Ben, but if you've lost a loved one, you can sympathize with how the web slinger felt. I don't know anyone who's ever fought a literal dragon, but most readers can recall a time they faced a fear that felt too big to handle, and yet they eventually come out on the other side. They've experienced a moment of doubt. They've experienced the determination to prove that doubt wrong or to protect something they love. They've experienced pride in accomplishing something difficult. So when your character is facing that dragon, that's the external conflict. But you shouldn't only be focusing on the mechanics of the fight. You need to make sure you include the internal emotion so that your characters are still real and relatable to read. Show the cost of failure in emotional terms, not just physical ones. Moving beyond the emotional and psychological state of your characters, you need to make sure your characters have a distinctive voice, especially in first person or close third. Voice isn't just about dialogue. It's about how your character thinks, what they're going to notice, how they describe the world around them. And this is where internal conflict often shows up naturally. A pessimist and an optimist will describe the same scene differently. A detailed-oriented person like Sherlock is going to notice things that someone who is much less meticulous will probably miss. Someone comfortable with violence will have a different internal narrative than someone who's squeamish. In From the Diary of Agnes Yeager, The Secrets of Silverleaf Academy by Veronica King, the titular character is direct, sassy, and regularly breaks the fourth wall. She's basically a middle grade appropriate version of Deadpool or even Ferris Bueller. And by me saying Deadpool or Ferris Bueller, you are probably already hearing them in your head. But distinct character voice doesn't only come into play when an actor is reading from a script. You need to give your characters that vocal distinction, even when there are words on the page. Your character's voice needs to reflect their background, education, emotional state, internal struggles, worldview, values, sense of humor, and their relationship to language itself. Some characters think in long, complex sentences, and others in fragments. Some use metaphors and imagery, others are brutally literal. Some characters will have an inner monologue full of jokes and commentary, and others are so present in the moment they don't have any commentary until they are doing a post-mortem on what happened. Your voice for a character needs to be consistent throughout, but I'm not saying your character will never change their mood or how they see and express themselves in reaction to certain events. But I say that they need to be a recognizable personality behind the narration or dialogue. It still needs to sound like them if they are scared in a way that you are not suddenly thinking you are with a completely different character. If you take an excerpt of your book and you remove the character names, can you identify who is there, especially in first person or close third? If you can't tell whose mind you're in, you might need to develop more distinct language or signs for readers. Additionally, you can test this by having a group discussion scene without dialogue tags, which I don't actually believe should end up in any finished manuscript. You need to know who is speaking and not be second guessing, is this line of dialogue spoken by character A or character B or character D. A strong character voice is going to make readers feel like they're inside the person's head. It creates intimacy and connection in a way that even knowing their emotions might not. Readers can stop thinking about the character and start experiencing the story through them. That's when you know your characters feel real. Now, let's talk about some mistakes in manuscripts. I've talked about this throughout the video, but making your character too perfect is boring because there's no internal conflict, there's no room for growth, no reason to worry. Second, a confusing backstory. I mentioned that any flaw you give your character should make sense from their backstory, but giving a character a tragic past doesn't automatically make them interesting. It's what they do with that past, either intentionally or unintentionally, that makes them interesting. Backstory is useful for understanding why a character has certain internal conflicts, but it's not a substitute for showing who they are now through their actions and choices as they move through. If you just tell me a character is funny and don't show it, that isn't helpful. This is where the show don't tell rule comes in. That can be confusing, and we do have a video plan to discuss that more. But you need to back up any claim about a character with evidence through the story. It can be through action, it can be through description sparingly, and it can definitely be through dialogue. Being able to balance all three makes for a great story and a great character. You also don't want to make every single character likable or dislikable in the same way. Not every character needs to be snarky, funny, warm, immediately sympathetic, the best friend you always wish you had, or the main character energy you aspire to. If you do that, your characters are going to start feeling too similar. We already discussed why your characters need to be distinct. Some of the most compelling characters are prickly, difficult, and deeply flawed. Think of Iron Man. If he were perfect, he would be less interesting. What matters is readers understand and find them intriguing and compelling. You don't need readers to want to become best friends with them. Don't forget your characters should be changing. A flat character arc has fallen out of favor because it is less compelling than a story where your character is forced to change. If your character is the same person at the end of the book that they were at the beginning, why did we take a journey only to end back up in the same place? Character development is called development for a reason. The character needs to grow, learn, or at least change in some significant way. Here's an exercise. Take your protagonist and write what they want, need, their major flaw, and how it connects to both their internal and external struggles. One thing that makes them vulnerable. It can be related to their flaw. It could even be their flaw, but make sure you are articulating why it makes them vulnerable. Talk about one thing that makes them strong and maybe about how that's going to help them fight whatever obstacles they're facing. But then also describe the biggest choice they're going to have to make in your story that will reveal both their internal values and make a change and impact the external plot. Remember, you want your character to be active. For big moments, you want your character to be proactive. Figure out a contradiction in their personality, why that psychologically makes sense, and if you can, tie it into the plot. Write a scene where your character makes that choice and reveals at least 3 elements you have listed out. If you can do these 7 things, you're well on your way to creating a character readers will care about. Someone with a rich internal life who drives your external plot without feeling like a cardboard cutout. If this video helped you and you would like a little more guidance on this, Inimitable Books has a character development PDF guide available through our Ko-fi page. You can get an extended version included in your purchase of the Query Ready course, which automatically gives you access to the Inimitable Writing community, where you will have Q&As with me, someone who has worked in the publishing industry for a decade, get feedback from me and your peers. Links to these resources are in the description below. Next, I'm going to be discussing villains readers love to hate, because your protagonist is only as compelling as the antagonist they're facing. Tell me in the comments, what does your character want most and need? Bonus points if you can explain their flaw that's getting in their way. And after you've done all that, check out our world building video, because a great character can't carry a story in a flat world.